Or I think I'm in the middle.
Well, hi, everybody. We're going to be talking about apps, and mobile apps. So we've got some stats. Constellation Research is looking at the mobile apps market, and we are thinking that we're going to get to about 27 billion in mobile apps by 2015. That's a huge number. Think about this. 1 billion of the 4 billion users on cell phones or on smartphones, 3/4 of them are using SMS. This market is growing. Apps are everywhere. Apps are changing. Apps are becoming disposable. But guess what? Apps are here to stay. So we've got two great guests here, Oren and Chris. We're going to be talking to them about what they do and where apps come and fit into this market. I'm going to start with Oren. What's happening in the market? What's happening in apps?
Well, apps, of course, are built on APIs. If you want to bake bread, you have flour. If you want to make apps, you have APIs. Programmable Web says that we're now up to 4,000 APIs that we're tracking. The graph of that is going up in sort of hockey stick manner. It's getting each 1,000 is happening faster and faster. And about 75% of those APIs come from companies that we don't think of as technology companies, retailers, media companies, people who are, we all expect the eBays and the Twitters and everybody to have big APIs, but when you see major retailers, you see companies like Best Buy and media outlets like New York Times and USA Today having huge success, we are seeing a huge explosion in the ingredients that go to cause apps.
But take a step back. What's an API? What do I need this thing?
So an API is actually pretty simple. If you have a web application, a web application has data and logic behind it, and then it has the application, which is actually how you interact with it. If you take away www.yoursite.com and you want to have access to those underlying things in order to create mobile apps or Facebook apps or integrate with someone else's service, the access to those underlying services is what's called an API. It's the ingredients for anything you do on the internet.
So it allows me to connect, to other applications.
You plug in and you do other stuff.
Integrate. Are you using APIs, Chris?
Can I take a big step back?
Yeah, you
before we just jump into it that quickly? Let's talk about what apps are not, which are sort of the assumption that they're cute little things that are downloaded, used by a few, generally hard to discover, and potentially something that comes and goes. Let's talk about what's the most important question to ask when I'm thinking about an application, which is, what are people doing? So on that subject, and where I'm going with this is, for too long, the conversation has been about page views, impressions, and clicks around web inventory. For mobile, what people are doing is they're playing social games, and I'll spare the audience by show of hands of how many people play social games. They're using Uber to find taxis. Yes. They're checking in. That is called activity and actions. The most important thing to look at when you think of social and social apps is activity and this is a brand conference, so I'm going to do Bill and Brian a solid because that's why this conference exists. For brands and agencies, when they're thinking about applications, they're thinking about social, and they're thinking about, okay, activity, the opportunity to leverage and reach people is through activity, not page views.
Yep, no,
yeah, that's really important. And one of the things we've seen, there's a lot of apps out there. We have 34,000 apps that run through Mastery currently. And what we see with these apps is that a great app is not your website shrunk down to fit on a smaller screen. A great app does one thing really well. At Mastery, we say a great app grants a wish. It does one thing for you, and it does it for a particular group of people at a particular time and place. So for instance, I use an app with American Airlines because I travel quite a lot. And that app, the only thing it really does that it does particularly well is it lets me open the app, see my flight, check in, get my boarding pass on my phone. That's it. I'm never going to book my vacation on it. I'm never going to create some huge itinerary on it. That's what it does for me. It functions very well for me during the travel time, and that's all. And we see this a lot. We see apps that are temporal. They have a short lifespan. Associated Press did an app around the World Cup. It had the standings, it had the videos, it had all this stuff, and hundreds of thousands of people used it for exactly 3.5 weeks, and no one's used it since. And that was considered to be a hugely successful app. And we're now seeing apps around events. We're seeing apps, not just sporting events, but around social events, around political campaigns, around marketing campaigns, around events like South by Southwest, all kinds of things where you're saying, this app is essentially like an ad campaign. It's no different than what you've done before. You're doing something that is meaningful to a targeted group of people at a targeted time and place.
Now back to Chris's point about apps being activities and events and tying that back. How are people doing it? How are brands coming back and using that to leverage a marketing campaign in terms of what you
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, it's a fundamental shift in how brands need to think about advertising. So the obvious approach from a brand is this is my objective, and this is what I want to force into this environment. That's a failure. That's going to be a failed campaign. Yeah. The right question is, what are people doing? How do they use this environment? Why do they play this game? Let the publisher dictate, because it's their app, it's their community, how people are using it. And therefore, that leads to, well, how do I leverage that particular activity? As I mentioned before, a check-in, a poll, a vote, a quiz. So activities are becoming front and center the #1 thing, according to various reports from Nielsen and eMarketer, that people actually do. And for the last decade, there has been zero innovation in advertising outside of search. And what I mean by that is, for the most part, publishers and ad networks have simply dressed up a banner in the form of rich media and better targeting, better cookies. That's no innovation in advertising. Activity is happening in the center of the page, not around it. And for brand advertisers, to get to your question, it really starts with understanding what people are doing and then trying to deliver an ad after that person takes that activity. So if you check in and you see an ad that says, "Thank you for checking in, continue with your game," or "You just voted, good job voting," and you're acknowledging what the person does, which provides context, you're more likely to have the consumer respond well and say, okay, this advertiser is there, they're allowing me to do what I was doing, #1, they're acknowledging what I did, and they're not interrupting me. So that's how brand advertisers successfully get into and understand social activity advertising.
Yeah, we're seeing a market where it's really important to use ads, activities as targeted engagement vehicles. On your end, what are you seeing in terms of different ways of leveraging that targeted engagement and tying that back to other platforms?
Well, one of the things that apps, most apps we talk about are mobile apps, and there are a handful of things that mobile apps, good ones, have in common, and one of them is almost all of them are location aware, right? So they know where you are, they can infer from knowing who you are and where you are, and when you're there, they can infer what you're doing. So we're seeing a lot of apps and brand activities around apps that do things like attempt to convert you from one location to another. You just walked into store X, competitor of store X can see that through a location-aware app, and they suggest that perhaps you would rather leave the door and go and talk to store Y. There are a lot of things we're seeing having to do with travel, where again, knowing your travel profile. One of the great apps that I've seen is the Hotel Tonight, which basically says, it's going to, I need a hotel room tonight, bam, I get one. Again, grants a wish, it doesn't matter. We're seeing individual hotel chains who are trying to target their frequent stayers, coming up with their own versions of that, right? Because that's something which they can do for their users. But location is one of the most important elements of these things.
No, and that's a great point on context and the context-aware services.
It's all about context, because without context, you might as well be sitting at your laptop, right? The device, by virtue of time and presence and knowing who you are and being able to track all that, it gives context, and that skips all the nonsense you often have to go through when you go into a website.
Right, and context is giving you the ability to get to real-time information, but really going to right-time information because of that filtering. On your end, Chris, what other context areas or other context-aware services, some are location, that you're seeing people use as they're building out apps?
Yeah, so I guess, well, the first point that I always like to make when there's a good platform is try not to build an app, which I think more brands need to hear themselves, because there's a graveyard of applications out there through Facebook and through mobile. Most brands and agencies are not set up to be successful. In fact, I really can't think of more than one or two that have been. Allow the experts that typically are the guys coming out of Stanford and other universities that study it and build organizations that are built by engineers. So leverage existing audiences rather than building your own, I think, is another fundamental shift that marketers need to really jump on if they want to find success. But your question was, what are the most popular activities that people are?
Well, no. What are some other ways that people are gaining context in these applications, and helping to get to the point of getting to real time, so that offers and activities? What are things in a platform people should be looking for? So,
Sure.
What do you mean by platform?
If you've got your mobile app development platform or mobile app.
Yeah, so careful there. So mobile app development platform is actually a really scary term. The concept of these things is that you can write once and run everywhere, and it sounds really, really seductive, except what it means is you have lowest common denominator, and it sucks equally everywhere. It turns out that when we saw this a lot at Mastery. So first we had the iPhone came out, and it had apps, and people said, I need an iPhone app. Or they'd say, I need a mobile app, which meant I need an iPhone app. And then Android came out, and they're like, oh, it's kind of sort of the same. We'll just run the same thing. And then the iPad came out, and people realized that different form factor, different OS. We still have some of those iPhone apps, believe it or not, where they show up on the iPad in a little size, and you push 2x to have them look big, right? That sucks, okay? And it further sucks even between, and it's a very, very subtle thing, what makes a 2-star app versus a 4-star app that people love versus what people hate. And Chris is right on. You can't just go to your developers and say, hey, you did our website, you're not busy, hey, do the mobile app, that'll work well. No, it doesn't. And so you need to understand that different people choose different devices, different OSs, because that's how they want to interact with them and because they do different things. Android has a back button. iOS does not. That alone means that somewhere within that app, if they're trying to work the same, either you're building an app for people who wish they had a back button and they don't have one to use, or you're building an app that presupposes there's a back button and there isn't one on the phone. Either way, it's going to suck.
Also, I just want to I know we have the subject, and most people get excited, or I think you're fine. You're not ranting. You're doing great. And people get excited when they see the application panel. But that's almost like using the term social media. Let's kill that word.
Yep.
It's everything that we do. It's not a thing. It's not a budget. It's not a carve out. It's not a panel. It's actually what everyone in this room does more than anything else on a daily basis. And that goes the same with the term app. So I was very happy to participate here. But any panel that's called apps, again, is not really it's not telling the story or doing it justice, because ultimately, from Angry Birds to the largest gaming companies that are providing social, obviously gaming is the #1 phenomenon. They're bona fide communities or websites. And the reason I know that, because I eat and breathe this space, but sometimes I think the notion that it's labeled app really begins to create a much smaller conversation that it deserves. And the only other point I wanted to make was back to why activity advertising or leveraging activity as a source is important. The most successful platforms in market today, there's been a fundamental shift in what's working. Companies like Spotify, platforms like Facebook, social gaming companies like Zynga, Twitter, et cetera, and the companies that build on them all have one thing in common: product and users first. Yep. Not even a close third, fourth, or fifth, meaning that it's more about the publisher-facing platforms, users first, and everything else will fall into place. And that's why activity is a very important piece of this conversation, because none of those platforms, or the apps on those platforms, is a very important point, allow traditional display. And I think our title is third screen or whatever. Yeah. So the point is even if you want to get into the most coveted inventory sets on the planet today, you have to think outside of your small little box, which is look inside of what people are doing rather than outside of what they're doing.
It's a great point. A number of our mobile clients, I mean, when you look at activities, it's really about creating that experience. It's a combination of those activities that drive the experience, and that's how we're getting to the engagement aspects. And then what you want to do with it.
Yeah. Let's remember why you're doing this, right? You are doing apps because you're trying to get to your customers where they are. We're in the post-website era. We no longer interact with the internet, usually, by sitting down, opening a laptop or desktop, typing, closing it, getting up, and going away. We now interact with the internet where we are, when we are, doing all kinds of things, sometimes when we don't even think that we're interacting with the internet. So that apps are the new version of doing what you've always done, which is getting to where your customers are and giving them the experience that is going to make them either want to engage with you more or further your business, which then goes to activities, which increasingly is also meaning transactions. So, you should look at your business and say, how do I make money? Let me make more money doing these things with apps and with mobile and with all these opportunities. It is doing and building more on what you're doing, just doing it in a mildly different way than you used to before, because there's a new tool around. But it's still no different than Starbucks putting shops on two opposite corners because they know that that's where their customers want it to be and how their customers want to interact with them.
That's a great example. How many people in the audience are building mobile apps right now as part of their campaign? Got a few out there. How many have someone else building it for them? A few more. OK, that's good to see. So, well, we should take some time. I mean, this make it a lot more interactive. Let's go for questions. See who out there has some questions for the audience. Let's get some mobile mics. Who's got a mic? Anybody? All right, you got mics back there. All right. Anybody want to know how you start, how you begin the process of beginning a mobile app? I'll start with you guys. Might as well ask.
Obviously, start with an API.
No. Let's take out the API. I'll start with Chris. How do you start? How do people go out and say, look, I want to do a mobile app. It's part of a campaign. I've identified the activities that are important. Where do they start and how do they begin?
They don't do any of that. The brand doesn't dictate the activity. The publisher or the existing app, as I mentioned earlier, has something that they want to leverage because there's opportunity to reach 50 million moms performing 30 million activities across mobile applications. And then the question is, how do I leverage that audience at scale, which you can do today? Which I know this has been a point that's been made a few times, but because this is a brand and agency-focused conference, I think it's important to really call out that in order to leverage the biggest shift that we've seen in how people consume and where they spend time, and this is sort of on par with search or video, activity in 12 to 18 months will be on par with when you say the word search. People understand what that means. And the reason that that's happening is because how people are spending their time and where they're spending their time are coming within social environments, typically driven by applications, and that's providing a much more relevant user experience. So I think that's the more important question is if I want to leverage, if I want to jump on this opportunity, how do I do that? And it goes back to allowing, being open-minded, allowing publishers to dictate how to leverage what people are doing to be successful.
Okay. So activity graphs will be the new hot thing, looking at where these trends.
Oh, activity graphs is one part of it, but also tying together those activities with how you measure value in your campaign or in your company in general. So, if I'm a business, I go to my agency, I go to my marketing department, and I say, I want you to go do something. It's because I expect some number somewhere to be influenced, ideally one that has to do with making money or whatever my goals are for that quarter or that year. Measure what's happening in your mobile or your app by tracking it all the way through to whatever you value.
And you know who endorses this 4 weeks ago? A company called Facebook. When they did their redesign, which I don't know how many people participated with the redesign, but it's Facebook's platform change is so you can find it's all around interest, music, Spotify, watching Netflix. So that's a company that is important to understand. If they're leveraging activity and they're focused on activity, I think that's a very important point.
We got one quick question in the back.
This question for Chris. Because, as you've said a few times, this is a brand conference. Or I'll stand up so you can see me.
Yep.
You guys. Can you put that in some context for us and give us an example? The comment that activity is going to be as big a concept as search is a really big statement, particularly in the time frame that you've said. So, from a brand perspective, as you think about the path to purchase, to use another brand-ism, where does that live? So, you've got, and I'll use the a diagram or a concept that's been around for a while, and that is you have the signal, somebody becomes aware of something. Now we have these paths to purchase and a final experience. In your mind, in activity, can you give us an example of where in that process, from signal to experience with the product, you see activity and what it might look like?
And we've
Sure.
got 30 seconds.
30 seconds. So Facebook did not have a strong search functionality. They actually had a very poor search functionality. So they had to think of how they could leverage what people were doing, which obviously they understand better than anyone else with 800 million plus people. It's an intent-based response. Understanding what people want is activity, which is essentially intent, and can yield intent to purchase. So ultimately, the way that brands are able to leverage this is by looking at the most important interest points, such as cooking, running, hiking. What are the applications that are associated, or the platforms that are associated with those interests? And then how do you get your brand messaging in line with that context? And again, Facebook's doing this right now. If you go and look at any of your friends on Facebook, you're going to see a Spotify news feed running on the right, which is the music they're listening to. That's kind of an example, but not sure if I fully answered it for you.
Well, we'll catch up with you in the back. Hey, thank you everybody for being part of this. Give these guys a round of applause.